Hello and welcome everybody to the Data Resilience SpectrumCast. As you can see, we're missing a block here. Today, our subject matter expert, Sean, is on vacation. So Sean, hope you're out there having a good time. But as always, joined by our other subject matter expert, Tricia Jiang. Hey, Tricia.
Hey, Steve.
And our co-host, Randy Arsenal. How you doing, Randy?
Hey, Steve, it's not the regular Hollywood Squares, but it'll have to do.
What we'll do for today.
Yeah.
So I just want to recap. For the last 7 weeks, we did the 6 key things needed for a data resilience infrastructure, and I thought the conversations went very, very well. So in the podcast today, I'll put the link to the Data Resilience SpectrumCast. I encourage everyone to kind of go back and listen to those 6 key things. And we even had a use case with Red Hat with Pete Bray last week. Very, very good. So this week, we're going to take a little bit of a departure from that. And we were talking amongst ourselves, and Tricia had a really good thought process around all of data resilience. We talk about backup. You need that data. Tricia, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of what you're thinking, and then let's have a conversation about that.
Yeah, so we talk about backup, like you said, but what about the files that don't need to be backed up, that should be excluded and included? And
Heresy, how dare you?
I know. Imagine that there's data that we don't need out there. And Randy, you really brought that up as it's actually a bigger question about cost savings and cost efficiency. But when we look at which files to exclude, I was trying to think, well, I know we have files out there that talk about good examples for the different platforms of what we don't need to back up. For instance, different system files or boot files. But then it becomes really industry specific. So do I back up the MP4s and the pictures? Maybe not if I'm a certain type of business, but maybe for other businesses, those are critical. So it really has to be customized based upon your company and the department that you're looking at.
Yeah, it seems to me that, and we talk a lot about, and we have talked a lot about cost and the fact that it can be a barrier to entry. So a lot of companies, they understand full well that they need to back up and they need to protect their data and protect themselves against cyber attacks and other events like that. But the cost can be prohibitive. So how do we sort of help them design a strategy that doesn't leave them exposed, but at the same time, it's not going to break the bank? So it's like, how do we prevent the perfect from being the enemy of the good, or however that expression goes, that is used a lot lately. And it just struck me as something that I think we can explore a little bit more. And, you guys have, a century of cumulative experience. So I think between us, we can maybe figure out some best practices and some methodologies that people might be able to apply to help manage the cost, but again, to do so without sacrificing protection.
Yeah, and when we look at the include, exclude files, which are kind of the core of not backing things up or making sure things are backed up, those have been around forever in Spectrum Protect and Spectrum Protect Plus. But I remember when I used to work support, 20 odd years ago, those were like a noodle of a mess of a list of exclude this, include that. How do I process this file? Is that file actually included or excluded?
Yeah. You know what this starts ringing true to me of that it brings me all the way back to something that we talk about foundationally around data resilience, which is data classification. I can really probably only do that. And Tricia, you bring up a good point, right? In some organizations, let's say, that might be companies that do specialized marketing for folks, there's a necessity to have MP3s and JPEGs and that sort of thing, right? But in other vendors or in other customers that are not, maybe they're engineering driven, maybe those things aren't important, right? So it isn't until I start classifying my data that I actually know, A, what do I have? And then B, where am I going to actually put it? And Randy, to your point, is it cost effective, cost efficient? Is it help me meet my SLAs? All of those things, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, again, it's like most of the things we talk about, it's kind of a balancing act, because we definitely want to help clients. I think the top priority is always to ensure their protection and secure their data and make sure their data is as resilient as it can be so that it doesn't risk a disruption to their business. I mean, that's always the end goal. But I think we got to sort of start taking down those barriers, whether it's cost or complexity or time to value or, change management, whatever. There's a million of them, right? So I think to the degree that we can better engineer and streamline the whole design and implementation process, I think that's helpful. And I think it's helpful not only from an operational perspective in terms of ensuring their security and the viability of their business, but also from a financial perspective to help them control costs. So that, when you think about it like that, it sounds pretty practical. Like, well, why wouldn't you do that? But I think there's these competing forces. There's this, like, you've got to back up everything all the time forever, or else you're dumb. And then there's the, just kind of roll the dice and take your chances, and, maybe you'll get lucky, right? So there's got to be a happy medium somewhere there.
Also looking at the source of the files, because if you've got a lot of remotely accessed files, just make sure you're not backing them up on every single endpoint that's accessing them, instead backing them up at the source. So back to the classification and understanding where that data is originally being generated at. And then making sure like things like dedupe are turned on, because that's obviously, if you are getting a lot of the same files, or at least the same chunks of files, that'll help immensely.
So Tricia, this brings up, I was thinking as we're talking here, right? So I like the point you just made about the endpoints and that sort of thing. Is there ever a time, and I'm sure it depends, as everything in IT is, right? But is there ever a time that IT might say to the end users, for a majority of the business or a chunk of the business, no, it's your responsibility. Pick a cloud provider. We partner with XYZ, maybe 2 or 3, right? And of course, we'll reimburse you, or we'll bear the expense. But would you just back up directly from your device to wherever it is, so you can kind of have control on it? And we're going to focus on core business components, right? Is that, I remember, in the days of when I used to work at Connected Corporation, right? That was kind of the thought process for businesses. But have we evolved past that these days?
I think that's kind of tricky as we look at more of the concepts of having your clients be able to back up using S3 connections. So taking those cloud pieces, those cloud applications, where is that data sitting at that you're talking about? Is it in the cloud and I'm protecting it directly to the cloud? Or am I trying to back it up directly from a workstation up to a cloud? And once again, you got to classify and got to understand, where is the data coming from and where do you expect it to be protected at?
Classic "it depends" answer. I love it.
Well, yeah, these are all the contingency model, as we call it in business school, right? So it's really dependent upon a lot of different factors. But I think we're getting to, again, sort of the heart of the issue, which is that it's not one size fits all. It's not back up everything all the time forever, or else you're putting your business at risk. I mean, again, there's going to be a middle ground. So how do we help clients achieve that kind of balanced state of, I'm well protected, I can recover quickly in the event of a disaster of some kind or a cyber event, but I'm not, breaking the bank. I'm not over investing and burning resources unnecessarily. And I think that gets to, this issue that we talk about a lot. So I mean, Trish, I'll ask both you guys. You've been doing this a long time. When you start to have those discussions with clients, what is their initial reaction? Is their initial reaction? I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, where do they fall on that spectrum of I need to be maximally protected on one end, and I need to save money on the other end? Like, where do they more often hew in that spectrum?
I think I've seen that kind of change over time, because it used to be more expensive, the storage to store the backed up data. And I think people were using and excluding a lot more data. And it seems as that storage has gotten cheaper, the attitude has been more like, well, this is my livelihood, back it all up, and then we can worry about it. But you got to remember, if you back it all up, then your restore is also going to be harder. And so that classification bites you in the butt on the end if you haven't done it properly.
And I think all of IT, and this comes all the way back from my father, right? IT is like a pendulum. I think I would agree with Tricia, where it became so expensive to back everything up that I had to start excluding stuff. I started excluding stuff, and now I feel like I'm missing something, and I'm going to get trouble if I can't recover it. All the way to now, I need specialized net new budget In the protection realm for things like PII, I need net new budget for things like cybersecurity or cyber resiliency. So now we got to find a place to get that money. And maybe getting that money is kind of taking some of that other data that was filling up that capacity and kind of pushing that off and making room for this new stuff. So it kind of oscillates back and forth. And you get the folks to say, well, I'd love to do what you're saying, Steve, but I can't afford it. And you start to bring up this whole class. Do you classify? Have you thought about this? Right now, there's a whole ton of options where the back end, Tricia, you mentioned S3, low cost options to go to backup, whether it be to the cloud or to tape, tape super inexpensive to store data on for long term. But again, it comes around the classification. If you know what you can put there, wonderful. And it's a great way to figure out how to save the most amount of money. If you don't, well, then, you're kind of rolling the dice again.
Yeah. Sorry, Trish, just a quick one on classification. I think another area where, especially now with the increased proliferation of AI workloads and sort of pipeline, ingest, analyze, action kind of workflows are becoming more prominent. That creates a lot of transient data. You've got working sets that are used in some phase of that pipeline. And then once the data, passes through that phase onto the next one, that data becomes either unnecessary to retain or of much lower value. And I think without understanding that pipeline process and the sort of viability of the data at each stage, I suspect a lot of organizations are backing up that transient data unnecessarily and probably consuming a lot of their backup space and cost for data that has no useful life cycle beyond that phase of the process. I think that happens more than we think, I bet.
And that actually leads me into my tool tip for today. Thank
Brilliant.
you, Randy.
Yes, you're welcome.
I think two things fall into place here is that you've got a lot of new types of data coming out, a lot of this transient data, and you've got include, exclude lists that were built eons ago that maybe someone hasn't looked at. So my tool tip is go out and look at some of your big production machines and find out, hey, what are the really big files out there? And you can do that with your normal operating system tools. Windows has them built in, AIX has them built in, just to see what are my big files out there. And then secondly, inside of Spectrum Protect, you can issue a DSM query include exclude, and that'll show you what your include excludes are. So you can kind of say, oh, wow, I'm backing up all these temporary files I don't even need. And they're not in my exclude list. Let's resolve that.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. And I mean, using like Windows you mentioned Windows. I mean, if you're backing up and doing sort of image backups of a Windows machine or a Windows image or instance or VM even, you've got these massive like swap files and, cache files that Windows creates in the background automatically, which are enormous. That if you're backing those up, that's just silly because every time you restore your machine and reboot from a clean image, those are recreated by default. So there's literally no need to back those up, and they're exceptionally large. So that's a great point. And it's something I do on my, giant like image or my giant video editing workstation is when I analyze the data, I'll use a visual map of where the data is and where the size and where the capacity is being consumed, and try to identify those huge transient files or those huge, recreate on reboot kind of files that the operating system manages, and obviously exclude those from the backup. Now, a lot of more contemporary backup solutions are smart enough to know that. So they will pre-configure themselves to eliminate or avoid those files or blacklist those files, but not always. So, and the same is true of every operating system. So that's a great point.
So, Randy, you had said you had done some searching on some interesting things around this whole excluding what you back up. You want to share that with us?
Yeah. So, interestingly, as I was trying to find some examples of things to maybe not back up or ways that you can do what we're talking about here, which is sort of control the cost and not overshoot your mark by, backing up everything all the time forever. And interestingly, it's kind of hard to find best practices and examples and industry trends towards backing up less stuff because, cyber attacks are on the rise. And for all the reasons we talk about every week, backup is super important and data protection and resilience are super important. So nobody wants to skimp on them, obviously. And, we are a vendor with a partner ecosystem that provides solutions in this space. So obviously we're not going to be keen on going out and, telling people what not to back up. So instead, I kind of came across this article that I think does a pretty good job of explaining. And, we all talked about cloud and how cloud backup has really changed the game in many ways. This article does, I think, a pretty good job of laying out the framework for why hybrid cloud or having a true hybrid cloud environment is a good way to help control costs. And it's for all the reasons you would imagine, right? Instead of having dedicated on-prem capacity, whether it's tape or spinning disk or whatever, if you use cloud services selectively, not necessarily for everything, but if you use those cloud services, you can definitely get some economies of scale because the storage capacity in the cloud is obviously very low cost compared to most on-prem. In most cases, not always. It's virtually unlimited. The initial entry investment is pretty low, so you don't have to make a huge capital investment up front. And interestingly, something that we don't talk about a lot is that there are also industry-specific data protection and backup solutions available to help with compliance and regulatory oversight. So that's something else that might otherwise cause you to incur some additional costs. So by taking advantage of those services, you can leverage cost benefits of the cloud providers, and it's great for them too because they can deploy specialized services that are industry focused and help their clients maintain the same high level of protection, but do so at a much more manageable cost. So, again, this is not exactly breaking news. This hybrid cloud model is something that lends itself extremely well to all sorts of workloads, and backup and data protection and data resilience are obviously no exception. So, we've already had discussions with some of our partners that deliver these managed backup and data protection services. This is kind of the golden age, I guess, for those kind of services. And I think that article did a pretty good job of simply laying out why. So.
I don't know, Tricia, what do you think? We've taken the guy, and this is probably close to our 50th data protection SpectrumCast. And we've taken the guy who always says he's the neophyte around protection. Listen to him. He's knocking it out of the park.
Include, excludes, love it. That's great.
I learn from the best. I'm just paying attention to listen to you guys share your war stories. So
that was some good things to share with the audience to say about what things they can be thinking about. So appreciate that, Randy. Thank you very much.
No problem. Good stuff.
All right, gang. This will kind of conclude this episode talking about data to be excluded from your backups should you decide you want to exclude anything. And we'll be coming to you next week with a new topic. So we appreciate this. You guys have a good day.
Thanks. We're going to make Sean do all the talking next time.
That's right. It's his turn.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.